Is your nonprofit fair and equitable? And even if you think you are, could you do better with it? That's what we're going to discuss in this episode of the Nonprofit Pod. I'm Melissa, a university business professor who specializes in nonprofits. And today we're going to dive into equity theory, an academic framework that sounds very educational, and it is, but I'm going to teach you all about it and talk about how you can make sure that you're applying this theory into practice in your own nonprofit organization. Why is this important? Because equity theory is a powerful framework that helps us understand motivation and fairness in the workplace. Now, this is a topic in the field of management called organizational behavior. And I love this topic because I love business and I love psychology. And organizational behavior is this great marriage between the two. So it helps us figure out how to drive business and profitability. Even for nonprofits, you need a profit. It's just the difference where the profit goes. It doesn't go to stockholders or investors or owners. It goes to making the world a better place. So with organizational behavior, we want to understand how to drive business success by tapping into the human psychology. And with equity theory, it's all about motivation and fairness in the workplace. The theory itself actually originates in psychology, but it has a ton of real-world applications, which is why it's so popular in business and in organizational behavior. So specific to the nonprofit sector, this can help nonprofit leaders build more engaged, satisfied, and motivated teams. And this isn't just your staff team, but it's also your volunteer team. So first, let's explore the science behind equity theory, and then I'm going to share with you some actionable steps that you can use to make sure that you're fostering fairness in your organization. So as I mentioned, equity theory is based in psychology. It was actually developed by a psychologist, J. Stacey Adams, and it's really simple at the root of it. It's simple, but it's profound. And the basis of equity theory basically says that people are motivated by, not surprisingly, fairness or equity. So with equity theory, it's all about how employees perceive, not always reality, but perception, but how employees perceive that balance between what they contribute to their job, that's what we call inputs, and they're always comparing that to what they get out of it in return, what we call outputs. So if you think about your nonprofit organization, your volunteers, they have all kinds of inputs. They're contributing to your agency their time, their skills, their expertise, their effort, their energy, their knowledge, all of these things, their loyalty and their commitment even. So your volunteers give a lot to your agency, but they do get something out of it in return. Even if they're not paid staff, like paid staff get pay, benefits, and bonuses, volunteers actually get something out of it too. They have outputs. And this is going to be things like recognition and praise, a sense of fulfillment, looking good on a resume, required volunteerism for their corporate job. It can be any number of things. But here's the twist. People don't evaluate this balance of inputs and outputs in a bubble. Instead, they're also comparing their input-output ratio to others in the organization. So if a volunteer perceives, for instance, and I have had this happen in real life, if an employee perceives that they're working harder or contributing more and they're giving more inputs, but they're receiving less outputs in return to their peers, they will then feel a sense of inequity. And that inequity is bad news bears. That is a feeling that can lead to frustration, decreased motivation, burnout, and the worst is a volunteer actually quitting and leaving your organization to go volunteer somewhere else. We don't want that to happen. But I've seen this time and time again, and I think sometimes in nonprofits we have a tendency to treat volunteers very differently than we do paid staff, and we don't think about these things applying to volunteers, when in reality it applies to volunteers just like it does any other member of an organization, regardless of their role. Now, I mentioned I've experienced this in real life, so I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story, so buckle up for this one. I had a volunteer at a nonprofit where I previously worked, and she was just a superstar volunteer. She was good-natured, she was always there to do everything you needed. She didn't just give of her time and her talent, but she also gave her treasure, and we know that's great in nonprofits when you have not just a worker bee who's there to do all the things, but also to donate money. She was so great, and she spent a lot of time with the staff team and with me. We all really grew close to her. We really liked her. So as such, she kind of became our exemplar for a wonderful, superstar, amazing volunteer. And that's great. We want to give recognition to our volunteers. We want to give them what I call that shine. And we were always showcasing her and thanking her in our newsletter and our social media pages and holding her up as an example and using her name frequently. And when we had opportunities for people to speak about our nonprofit, she was our go-to gal. We would always call her. We knew she would be there. She'd be reliable. She'd do a great job. But you know what happened is a lot of other volunteers saw that. In their minds, their perception was, well, we're giving just as much to this nonprofit as she is. So our inputs are the same, but she's getting a lot more outputs. And again, it's crazy because these are all volunteers. They're not paid. So it's not like this person makes more money than me. It's this person's getting more recognition than me. And that led to a pretty significant amount of strife because there was that inequity. And there was a certain contingent of volunteers who, in their minds, they perceived that difference between inputs and outputs. And so we kind of had a level set and realize, okay, well, we are actually giving more to this volunteer in terms of her outputs. And yes, it is very well deserved, but there are other volunteers that are just as deserving too. So maybe we should be a little more mindful of distributing our rewards equally, especially based on inputs, because a lot of these other volunteers that were disgruntled, they were great volunteers too. And we don't want to alienate anybody, especially our really good volunteers. So that's why equity theory matters in nonprofits. It's important in any organization, but it's particularly critical in nonprofits. Why? Because our employees and our volunteers and all the people who support our agencies, they're driven by passion for the mission, usually. Sometimes you get an employee who literally is doing it just for the paycheck. But if you choose nonprofit for a paycheck, you chose the wrong career path, kiddo. But it happens. But generally speaking, employees, volunteers, stakeholders, and nonprofit organizations, they choose to get involved with that agency because of that passion, because of that commitment and alignment with the mission. But even passion has its limits. And those limits can be tested when fairness is lacking. Now, let's talk about some common challenges where inequity can creep in. And again, this is usually not intentional. Never did I come to work and say, as executive director, I'm gonna hold this one volunteer up on a pedestal and give her all the praise and ignore all of these other great volunteers and make them feel that there's inequity in place or unfairness and then make them feel unmotivated and disgruntled. It's never intentional. So here are some common areas where, let's just call it inequity creep, can happen. So if you work in a nonprofit, whether it's a staff member or a volunteer, be mindful of these things. The first is what I experienced in my example, unequal recognition. When only a few employees or volunteers or board members are constantly getting publicly praised and constantly getting accolades, others might start to feel overlooked, even if their contributions are just as significant. And especially then, because they're perceiving, my inputs are similar to this person, why are they getting so much more in outputs compared to me? Because again, the key of understanding equity theory is knowing that people aren't just evaluating and measuring their own inputs versus outputs, kind of like on a scale, but they're also looking to other people and looking at their inputs and outputs. Another example, and this can apply to staff or volunteers, is unbalanced workloads. I get it. I've never worked for a nonprofit that I would say is adequately sourced in terms of people or budget. They're small teams usually, they're overstretched, there's not enough money. So if you have certain employees or volunteers that feel like I'm taking on so much more work than everyone else, but I'm not getting adequate outputs out of it, either recognition or compensation, this is going to fester resentment. It can create a really bad situation. And I've unfortunately seen that happen too and had it happen in my own nonprofit organizations. Another is limited advancement opportunities. If you work in an organization like many nonprofits, they're flat. So what flat means is you have one boss, usually an executive director. They have a lot of subordinates. You don't have layers of management because what nonprofit can be affording that, right? But if you have a flat organizational structure, that means there's less of a corporate ladder to climb. There's fewer promotion opportunities, there's fewer growth opportunities, at least the perception of that, and that can create a sense of inequity when those limited growth opportunities are not distributed fairly or distributed at all. So what happens is even your most passionate volunteers and employees can have their motivation destroyed when they sense these imbalances occurring. So then we come to the million-dollar question. How can we apply what we know about equity theory to a nonprofit organization to ensure that we're creating a fair and motivated workplace? So next I'm going to give you some actionable strategies that you can take to ensure fairness and equity in your organizations. First is to conduct a fairness audit. I know you are busy. I could never even see straight working in a nonprofit because I was so darn busy all the time. But this is one of those things that tends to fall to the back burner and the wayside and gets ignored until it becomes a massive problem. So I urge you to make this a priority. And with a fairness audit, what you're going to do is you're going to sit down. It doesn't take a ton of time, but you're going to really take a critical look at assessing your organization's current state of equity. You can survey your team. Use anonymous surveys. There's free tools that nonprofits can use to send that out, to ask employees about their perceptions of fairness in the workload, their fairness of compensation, recognition, growth opportunities, all of these things that people evaluate with equity theory. And make sure that you include some open-ended questions so you can dig a little deeper and get more information. And this is something that if you're surveying staff might feel better if it comes from a volunteer versus an executive director or another staff member in a leadership position. It just feels a little safer, I think, if it's coming from a volunteer. And the volunteer is assuring the staff, I'm not going to share this feedback with your executive director or with your boss. Another part of this is to hold one-on-one meetings. And this can be something that you delegate to a volunteer. And a volunteer, again, promising and actually following through on confidentiality, can have personal conversations one-on-one with your staff team. And conversely, your staff can do one-on-one meetings with your key volunteers. And these are important because these meetings can help uncover and reveal frustrations that your employees or volunteers might not express in a survey. Another part of this is to analyze pay and benefits. I hate to say this, but I cannot tell you how many times in the nonprofit sector I saw gross inequities in pay. And sometimes it was gender, it was ethnicity. This is a rampant problem in nonprofits, but I'm not going to get on that soapbox. I'm just going to tell you, as part of a fairness audit, it's important that you analyze pay and benefits as well. This includes not just making sure that you're looking at data within your organization for paid positions to make sure people are paid fairly based on their job title and their inputs, and you're not having some subconscious biases, which can happen to the best of people. I believe this is often unintended, but it happens, unfortunately. And not just do an internal analysis of pay and benefits, but you've also got to compare your compensation packages to industry benchmarks to ensure fairness within your team. Because when it comes to equity theory, people aren't just not only evaluating inputs and outcomes or outputs themselves, also comparing it to other people in the organization, but they're also comparing these to people outside of the organization, which is why it's important that you do an industry benchmark analysis when it comes to analyzing pay and benefits. So it's really important to use the data here that you gather to identify areas where employees might feel inequities and then develop a plan to address them. After you complete a fairness audit, it's really important that you address those imbalances, because otherwise there's no point in doing an audit. Okay, you're aware of inequity, but you gotta fix it, right? So after you conduct that audit, it's time to take action. In terms of reviewing compensation, it's not always feasible or even possible to raise salaries. So if that's the case, if you've identified there's a major inequity in salary, either internally or externally, look at alternatives. I will say, if you uncover an inequity in pay internally, you better make it a priority to raise salaries, even if it is a stretch, because you might be looking at some potential legal ramifications. But if you find that your agency is equitable internally, but you're falling behind your nonprofit peers in your city or in your region, and you can't raise salaries, at least look at other options, like enacting more flexible work schedules, giving your staff additional time off, or even giving them special professional development opportunities. Because remember, what you're trying to do here is balance that inequity, their inputs versus their outputs. And if employees start to perceive, I'm giving all of this, but I'm only getting this in return compared to every other nonprofit, you know what they're gonna do. Even if they're super mission driven, they're passionate about the cause, they're gonna leave. So this is how you can help balance that scale. Another thing you can do is standardize recognition. This is what I had to do when I had my little inequity problem. I had to create systems to ensure that all employees and volunteers feel appreciated. Actually track this in a spreadsheet. I know it's hard when you're busy and someone calls and says, hey, I need someone to come out and do a check acceptance recognition photo opportunity because we're donating $10,000 to your cause. And you're like, oh, I need a volunteer to go accept this check and take a picture and smile pretty and put it on Facebook. It's really easy to go to the same person over and over and over again. but that can lead to feelings of inequity. It can lead to a lack of motivation. So even track in a spreadsheet really quickly. Set up a Google Sheets that your team can access all, or in a shared drive. And you make note of all of these little PR opportunities and all of these volunteer of the month recognitions, and really make sure that you're balancing it out. And you're doing that not just with your volunteers, but also with staff. Now, when it comes to staff, although this applies to volunteers too, it's really important that you equalize workloads. You have to ensure that tasks are distributed fairly based not just on capability, because what happens then is your superstars are overburdened and you keep giving them more work without additional compensation, and that creates a whole lot of inequity on different levels. So you need to make sure that tasks and workloads are distributed fairly on capability, availability, and on fairness. And being transparent when you're making decisions is really important too, because you want to try to reduce perceptions of favoritism. So if there is a reason that you need to give someone a lighter workload, as much as you can, be transparent in explaining why. I'm giving Jane a break on doing our monthly Facebook posts because she has her big fundraiser coming up and she's really busy, but she'll pick that back up next month. So just being open and transparent, so that can help reduce perceptions of favoritism and unfairness. Another is being transparent about decision making. Transparency is key in a lot of things in leadership, and being transparent can help prevent misunderstanding and can help prevent perceptions of unfairness. And with the transparency of decision making, you have to explain the why. So when you're making decisions about promotions, pay raises, workload assignments, these types of things, to the extent you can, because not everything can be publicly shared, but to the extent that you can, be clear in communicating your reasoning. So for example, maybe say to volunteers, I'm introducing Andy. He's been a volunteer for a long time. I've just promoted him to the chair of our 5K fundraising walk. Here is why. Because he's been involved for 20 years and he's attended this event every year and he's one of our top fundraisers and he's really organized, da 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 da. Not just, hey gang, here's Andy. He's your new volunteer leader and chair of the walk fundraiser. So in this case, it's not about just fairness, because choosing Andy for that position is probably the fair thing to do, but you need to demonstrate fairness. Because remember, with equity theory, moreover than anything, is that perception of equity. You also want to set clear criteria. Define how decisions are made, because you want to make sure everyone knows the rules of the game that they're playing. If you don't know the rules, it's kind of hard to play a game, and that can lead to a sense of unfairness and inequities and senses of favoritism. So define how these decisions are made, whether it's for raises, promotions, leadership roles with your volunteers, or recognition. Make sure everyone knows what's expected. Another is involving your constituents. Giving your employees or volunteers voice and a say in decisions that affect them helps foster a sense of trust and fairness. And this can be as simple as holding regular feedback sessions, which we kind of talked about, or even something as old school as setting up a suggestion box and then actually reading the feedback and taking it to heart. Another thing that's important when it comes to equity theory and nonprofits is making sure that you're creating growth opportunities for everyone. As I mentioned earlier, nonprofits generally have a flat structure. So you've got one executive director, you may have a development director or two, and then a lot of employees that report to the same boss. But even in nonprofits with flat structures where it seems like your career is stuck and there's no growth or ladder to climb, there are still opportunities where you can help employees feel like, yeah, you might not be necessarily getting a promotion to an official new job title and leadership abilities, but you're progressing in your career. One thing you can do is offer professional development, provide training, be willing to invest. And again, I know that's a scary word for nonprofits, but investing in your people is the best thing you can do. Invest in ways that they can advance their learning, they can participate in mentorship opportunities, they can access industry conferences, give them the time off to go attend an industry conference, because even minimal investments in growth can have a big impact, not just in the stuff that your employee learns and brings back to your agency, but in their sense of fairness of having professional development opportunities when there may not be opportunities to actually get a traditional promotion. Another thing is to encourage cross-training. Allow your employees to learn new skills in other departments. If you've got someone that plans a gala fundraiser every single year, let them rotate around. It's called job rotation. Let them learn new and other skills in other departments. This benefits both the organization and that individual's sense of growth. Now be sure to communicate, be transparent, talk to them first, because not everybody wants this. So doing that, you might uncover that, yeah, they want to learn new skills that they can then translate to your current agency, but also to their own professional and personal growth. And something that's really important to remember when it comes to applying equity theory to any organization, including nonprofits, is that doing a fairness audit or equity audit isn't good enough just one time. It needs to be an ongoing effort. Make it a concerted effort to conduct annual fairness audits. Schedule it around your annual end of fiscal year or your annual board meeting. Revisit those perceptions of equity to make sure that your efforts are making a difference and that you're not slipping back into old inequities. You also want to create feedback loops. Build a culture of feedback and transparency where your staff, volunteers, your donors, they know that they have a safe space to give feedback and that they're actually going to be heard. This helps you address issues in equity and other things before they escalate. And finally, adapt as you grow. As your nonprofit evolves, so should your equity practices. Maybe you now have more funding to actually build in positions and traditional professional paths for your employees to get promotions. So evaluate those things as your nonprofit evolves and grows. So ultimately, equity theory gives nonprofit leaders a practical framework. It's not just textbook academic research stuff, but this is real life stuff that can help us understand how fairness impacts employee motivation and satisfaction. And it goes the same for volunteers, donors, board members, and everybody else. By prioritizing fairness and doing the things that we talked about here, you can create a much more engaged, motivated, and high-performing team. If you're ready to take your leadership skills to the next level by learning about things like equity theory and so much more, I have a free, yes, free leadership bootcamp for nonprofits where we explore strategies like this to help your organization thrive. You can find that at thenonprofitprof.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Nonprofit Pod. I'll see you next time.